We're doing a different angle today. How you doing? Hello everybody, welcome back to the Educatedcollins Snap channel. Today we're going to be talking about Gladiator. Spoilers, I don't think this card is that good, and then we're going to talk about some of the things that could make it better and also some deck designs. We have some interesting decks, but overall, let's get started. Gladiator is a 3/7 with the ability at the card from your opponent's deck to their side of this location if it has less power to die, essentially. So it's an interesting card, very similar in function to Yondu in terms of that it pulls a card from your opponent's deck, and then a little bit different than Yondu in that it's not guaranteed to die. You have to fit this criteria. But it does synergize in destroy decks because if you can get the kill right, that'll buff up your null, that'll buff up your death. It can work in mill if you're wanting to play a lot of card draw cards. So Yondu, we have Crystal, right? Gladiator as well. If you want to Magik also kind of mills in that sense. So there's definitely some ways to do that if you want. It's definitely not a full archetype, I think, but it's another tool in that toolbox if they keep releasing cards with similar effects. Then Surfer, of course, right? It being a 3-cost card. You always have to think about it. Why does this show 0/0? Oh no, the card art is wrong. Anyways, and then another good effect is if you're playing cards that buff cards, then it being a 3/7 could definitely do some work. And then Junk is also another way of dealing with this. If the opponent has nothing on their board when you play this card, or nothing, like if their opponent's board is filled when they play this card, then you don't get the mill effect or you don't get the pull effect. So that's a way of avoiding that completely as well. So it's definitely an interesting card. I would say there's like a big issue with it, a big caveat for me in terms of whether I'd recommend this card, and that's basically its timings, how it decides when it kills and what happens when you're killing. So I will say the timing for this card is not favorable for Gladiator at all. It's weighed super negatively in terms of Gladiator for the cards that are pulled favor. So what happens is when you play this card, it pulls a card from your opponent's deck, and then your opponent's card gets to trigger their effect, right? And then based on the power it is when the effect is triggered, that's when Gladiator decides whether to kill the card or not. So initially when this card came out, right, first of all, it was a 3/8, which was definitely better stat line. But another issue was that, or another consideration was that we weren't assuming that Darkhawk would live. We weren't assuming that there's a chance for Null to live. We weren't assuming that Devil Dinosaur would live. We kind of assumed that before those ongoing cards got their power, Gladiator would kill them off. And that makes it a lot better where it's like, okay, Devil Dinosaur doesn't matter. You can kill Darkhawk. You can kill all these like fancy, powerful cards that need to scale. You can kind of kill them off. Now you really cannot do that. So cards like Devil Dinosaur will live. Black Panther will live because what happens, you'll summon the Black Panther. The ongoing will trigger. It'll become an 8-power card, and then it'll live. So it really, that really puts a lot of the benefits of this card down in the dumps, right? A lot of those cards are like really powerful win conditions for the opponent that if you killed off their Black Panther, that's a lot of their win condition gone. Same thing with dinosaurs, right? A lot of times that's their win condition. So being able to just kill those off without dealing with them at all is just really nice and just gives you an avenue of winning. But the fact that that doesn't happen just really makes this card feel a lot worse. Another issue is like on reveals will trigger. So things like Doctor Doom, even if you kill their Doctor Doom, you do trigger the Doom bots. So you will get, they will be getting a net benefit from your activation. So there's a lot of cards like that, White Tiger and stuff, where, yeah, you might kill the main body, but the on reveal is really why you play the card. So it's there's a lot of little issues for this card that really makes it a hard sell, especially when you're like, oh, this is the week you have to use your resources. Um, I would not really be so inclined to do that. So with all that in mind, of course, right, I think this is to no bird's surprise. I'm not recommending this card. I just think the card is too risky, and destroying a card in your opponent's deck does fundamentally functionally nothing. So a lot of people are like, hey, you destroy a card. Well, the way you should look at card draw and accession and card milling is that if you're not milling all the cards in your opponent's deck, your mill did nothing, right? Essentially, instead of the card that got destroyed, a card whatever, what you can think about is instead of them drawing their blue marvel or whatever you destroy, you're instead just like they're just gonna draw their Darkhawk instead, right? So it's not like you really change the game by destroying something. The power could be in your knowledge of you killing that card or your knowledge that they can't play that card against you. But in terms of like fundamental game understanding, just milling a card doesn't do anything in the game. So you're essentially just playing a 3/7 with some info, right? Like it's not it's not the craziest card in the world. Now you can obviously add some extra cards to your deck that can take advantage of this mill, right? Death and Null are some of the two big winners, right? If you can get free destroys, but fundamentally, it's not necessarily a powerful effect in what it does. And then playing around his effect has little value and it's just not worth building around. So things like we just had Miss Marvel, right? That's an effect that has huge value, 10 power potentially, and it's worth building around, right? It's good to have a deck that can play Miss Marvel in the middle lane and functionally play the game the same way. So this is not a Miss Marvel level card in terms of like if you play around Gladiator, are you really getting a huge payoff? No, like you're getting a 3/7 instead of a 3/5 or a 3/6, right? Which is usually the stat line of a three drop, right? A 5 power is usually the stat line. You're getting a 3/7 instead. Like it's not winning you the game. So it's just not a card I really want to focus on. I definitely think there are some ways to make this better, some considerations. I would say the two main considerations, first of all, is you could just increase its stats, right? This is the simplest one, probably the one that secondary is going to choose, where you just make it a 3/8, see how that performs. If it's still not working, then you can make it a 3/9. 3/9 is crazy though, right? Like so, 3/8 I think is definitely something that you could work with. So that would be the initial impression. Or second idea is instead of pulling from the deck, you pull from the hand. Now, I will say that makes this card way better, like way better. Like like it's so much better if you pull from the hand. It's like a mini Doctor Octopus, right? With some real downsides for your opponent, right? Like you get to see their hand, you get to just like mess with their timings, mess with their game plans. It's significantly better if you did that. So that's the like extreme buff. Honestly, I think you could definitely try a 3/8 without pulling from your hand, and then just see if that's enough to make it work. So obviously there are some decks that can play this, right? Silver Surfer and whatnot, but those are, in my opinion, right, and the stats do agree that it's not a great card. Honestly, I would say it's a card that makes your deck worse, in my opinion. Like that's my take. So I wouldn't jump for joy to make it better. However, there's still some things to it, and I'd definitely like to see what they do with this card in the future. But then, as always, we do talk about the synergies. Some of the synergies is Death Null. I think those are the two easiest. Silver Surfer is also pretty obvious. Yondu's a synergy if you're gonna full mill. There's definitely some decks that can do that. I do have a deck showcase of somewhat milling level deck. Um, then Forge is nice because you can buff up the base power and then kill more targets. Zero and Cosmo kind of do what kind of neutralize the effect in their own ways. Then you have Shang-Chi. In case you pull something that's too big, Shang-Chi can definitely take that out. So it's kind of an insurance um, for the Gladiator. However, if you are building with like, hey, it's not gonna work, this card is gonna be negative value. Like it's not the way you want to design decks. So even though it's synergy, it's a bit weird. And then Dark Octopus, you fill their lane so that the Gladiator doesn't pull anything at all. So there's definitely some ideas here, but those are some of the synergies that I could find. All right, now we always talk about the spotlights, right? So if there were no spotlights and you were looking at this card in isolation, I would say do not get this card. However, Second Dinner doesn't do that. No, they don't. They love to put it with the spotlight so that you have to consider, do I want Gladiator? Do I want Loki? Is Loki enough to make me get a new card I don't really like? And I would say Loki still is, in its current form, good enough to make you consider getting Gladiator. So if you're missing Loki, I think it is fair to consider getting it. Now, I would say it's not that crazy to skip, right? You can always skip Loki and then get Loki in January, right? So, and it's next to Elsa if you don't have Elsa as well. But Loki is good enough and functionally strong enough still that I think if you want to get Loki, you don't want to wait. It's fine to just get Loki now and then play with it. So, it's more of a consideration for this week. Do you want Loki than do you want Gladiator? Because I would say Gladiator's not a card you really want to be spending too much resources on, but Loki is acceptable. So that would be my thoughts there. Now let's look at some of the decks. I do have some interesting decks to showcase. The first one we have, I would say, is the one that's performing the best with this card in, because generally I would say archetypes do worse with Gladiator. So that's my takeaway. Like on general, Gladiator isn't necessarily making your deck better. It'd probably be better to just play a different card because you have those, like, people right now. Like, the thing is, right now people are aware that some people are trying Gladiator, so there's a lot more expensive cards, like, as like an okay option in these decks. So it's easier to just lose off of that. But I'd say for now, you could definitely run something like this. This is just a point slam deck. So you just have lots of cards that give you lots of points. And Nightcrawler, I'm just gonna throw that in there. Nightcrawler for the flexibility, Nightcrawler so that you can go into the storm lane. Well, other than that, the rest of it is just like lots and lots of points. And they're just saying like Gladiator is better than, what's the one card? The other 3/7. What is he called? Maximus. Gladiator is better than Maximus, right? Like, sometimes it doesn't draw you 2 cards. It just gives your opponent a Doctor Doom's bots or something, right? But in general, I think that's fair, right? In a lot of cases, it's not going to just lose you the game. So, definitely a nice point slam deck if you want to play something like that. It can work. I don't have too much issues with it. Next up, we have just a classic destroy. But instead of running something like Sabretooth or so, you're just playing Gladiator. It procs your null, it procs your death. It's just a synergistic card when it doesn't summon something for your opponent. So when it doesn't do that, it's good. But in those scenarios where it's pulling like your opponent's death or anything like that, then it's a little bit bad. We're not running like Shang-Chi. There's in this deck, there's usually a flex spot or two, right? Shang-Chi sometimes played in there. Sometimes you have Bucky Barnes, things like that. You're just playing Gladiator instead. It's generally fine. I don't hate it, so it's definitely something you can do. Next up is a little bit more interesting, I believe. Here is kind of like a junk mill deck where you want to be kind of grinding your opponent out so that you can kind of mess with them in the final turns. So you have this Yondu, you've got this Spider Ham, Nico Minoura, all that stuff. You can bounce it back and keep playing the Yondu. That's a big deal. Same thing with Gladiator. You can beast Gladiator to do it again. So you're trying to get these cards out of your hand, out of your opponent's deck. You've got this Magik, right, making the games take longer, so you have another turn to do that. And then your late game is something like Dr. Octopus to just fill one lane with random cards from your opponent's hand, and then you can kind of win the other 2 lanes. Or you can fill cards with your opponent's hand. Then you can go Shang-Chi, kill their big cards, and then null to win the game. Or you can just null anyways. If your gladiator is killed enough targets, you can just null anyways, and it's still fine. So this is definitely a more interesting deck. This is harder to pilot. This is not the easiest deck to pilot at all. You have to be thinking quite ahead. But it's a fun looking deck, and if you have Gladiator, if you bought Gladiator, if you went for the Loki and end up getting Gladiator, this is definitely something you can try, see if it's fun for you, see if it works. And then next up we have, I believe, Surfer. Of course there's Surfer. Surfer just makes sense. It's a 3/7. You could play Maximus once again, right? Like you could just play Maximus, or you could play both. Honestly, maybe playing both is better. We do have Mobius in here just for tech answers. I think you could just switch Mobius from Maximus if you really want to go full point slam in Silver Surfer. But there's a lot of 3-drops that you could play. Honestly, there's so many 3-drops in the game that are like Silver Surfer candidates. So just definitely feel free. I think Rogue is really powerful. Probably what's carrying the deck, if I'm going to be honest. In this meta, I would say Rogue is doing a lot of work. There's a lot of good targets, so I wouldn't be surprised if this deck does well and you're like, oh, Rogue is just carrying me. Yeah, I wouldn't be too surprised. But yeah, Silver Surfer is a perfect candidate for Gladiator. Makes sense. And then the last one we have is, hear me out. All right, hear me out on this one. Cerebro 7. Huh? What do you think, huh? Yeah. Not crazy. There's enough targets, I think. That it's not the worst thing. You're still playing the Luke Cage. There's nothing on 2 that really made sense to play with this. So we just have generic 2-drops. But your 3s, 4, and 5s are pretty good with 7 cost cards. That makes sense. And then, you've got Onslaught on 6. Like, that's not bad. Like, Onslaught on 6 is not a bad deal. Right, if you can get the Cerebro on the Onslaught, you're doing okay. So I think it's okay. I think it's okay, deck. Would I try it myself for fun? Maybe a Conquest. I'll just see if it works in Conquest. But I just had to throw it in there because I could make it, right. It could be made. So had to try it. But other than that, overall, I'm not the biggest fan of Gladiator. I just think there's too many limiting factors and it's too risky to recommend you spending resources on it. But if you get it randomly or if you went for Loki and haven't, there's definitely a couple of decks to try. And honestly, it's a card I could see get buffed, right? And then maybe it's a little bit better. So there's always that potential, right? I do think they are trying to focus more, especially for newer cards, to buff them into relevancy. So if Gladiator stats are bad, which I think they are, I do think it's definitely a candidate to get some love. Maybe make a 3/8. I think that's the easiest change, to just make it a 3/8. And then the Cerebro deck is dead, right? But that's a sacrifice I'm willing to take, So other than that, anyways, take care of yourselves. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.
Educatedcollins snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap.
What's Kratos doing in
this? Will be improving. How you doing? You'll hit infinity, you won't go back. Educatedcollins snap.